Imagine, if you will, a shipping simulator beyond your comprehension. A mess of poor translations and imbalances designed to horrify the masses. But none so terrifying as what lingers at the bottom of the bench. Despite being a relatively simple game about three nobles speedrunning a cross-continent race to see how quickly they can humiliate Eric and his stupid face, FE7 is a surprisingly divisive game, with some claiming it to be among the series' strongest while others think it's overrated and a generally pretty mediocre entry. However, there's one opinion that remains pretty consistent, regardless of which side you're on, and that's that the unit balance of the game is pretty damn janky. This is due to the fact that the majority of the stronger units in the game are pre-promotes recruited later into the game, who, for the most part, will outclass characters that you had been training up to this point. For example, while Urk is perfectly adequate by himself, offering early game magic utility and decent growths, he will almost always be rendered obsolete by his mentor, Pent, who boasts obscenely strong base stats and mastered weapon ranks, giving him utility in areas that Urk will need heavy investment in order to reach, while Pent is able to do so right from the get-go. These aren't the units that we're going to be talking about though, as I want to discuss the characters who will likely see the bottom of the bench. Hence the name. Meaning the only time they're going to be deployed is when they're either free or being used by die-hard fans who really want to see Dorcas reach the dizzying heights of 10 speed. These units are usually terrible, to the point where dweebs like me feel the need to try and fix them so that they can reasonably compete with the stronger characters. We're going to be covering 8 of them, with some definite similarities between them, such as both early game archers being present, but in my attempts at making these units into something more interesting and usable, I've also tried to make them feel as different as possible, as the only thing worse than a unit that contributes nothing to the overall army is one that doesn't feel good to use. Moreover, I've also given myself a little bit of a goal with these buffs, that being to place these otherwise low tier characters into different levels on the generally accepted tier list for Hector hard mode, meaning that some will receive more significant buffs than others and Lin mode will be completely disregarded as it should. There were literally no parameters for this, by the way. I just did this so my brain would have to figure out a way to put Lin in A tier without making her completely busted. Anyway, let's start with 2 of the simpler units, that being the fighter bros, Dorcas and Bartre. Dorcas is a very straightforward unit. He's the early game fighter that has reasonably high bases, offset by the fact that he has far weaker growths than your other units, crippling his mid to late game performance should you choose to use him in the long haul. In theory, this unit type works perfectly fine, and has been shown to be genuinely effective in the form of Garcia in Sacred Stones, who follows the same archetype. The main difference being that Garcia's bases are far more impressive than Dorcas's, and he's also in a much easier game. My goal was to place Dorcas in C tier, and my primary idea on how to improve his weaker areas were incredibly simple. All he needs is a stronger set of bases to improve the one area where he's supposed to excel, the early game. Giving Dorcas improved growth rates would defeat the purpose of the character, as if you want a fighter with good growths, it just so happens that another one joins with him, fitting that bill relatively well. In order to give Dorcas a more significant role in the earlier chapters, and perhaps justify deploying him when you actually have the chance, he's received buffs to his strength, skill, defense, and resistance. +2 strength and skill will give him an immediate boost to his reliability and damage, putting him on par with Hector and Bartre in terms of combat, but with the additional +3 defense, he's far more capable of being left to clean up groups of enemies come enemy phase. One of my biggest issues with Dorcas and vanilla FE7 is his rather lackluster bulk, and while I do think fighters should mainly have HP as their way of mitigating damage, I think giving Dorcas an extra boost to act as a tank for your other squishier units in the early game will give him utility that units like Hector and Oswin also have. Other than these changes to his bases, Dorcas remains unchanged. I wanted to make him a middle-of-the-pack unit, around the same level as Guy and Dart, having some niche utility that will give him some viability in certain parts of the game, but unlikely to have a consistent deployment slot past around about the Dread Isle. Not every unit needs to be an endgame unit, so to say. Some will simply be useful due to their impressive bases, and fall off due to less than adequate growths, almost turning him into a lesser version of the Jagan archetype, while the actual Jagan is still being brought all the way into endgame. Thanks, Intelligent Systems! Bartre, in my opinion, is one of the most enjoyable units to use in Blazing Blade. He's 100% a meme unit, there's no doubt about that, with piss poor bases leaving him unable to double literally anything, but with his appearance, his bold personality, and that sweet 40% speed growth, You try to use him as long as you possibly can, on the off chance that he prospers into something exceptional. Of course, these dreams die when you get him to level 15, and he's still sitting pretty on 6 speed. Compared to his fighter brother, Bartre feels like he's supposed to be more growth-oriented rather than bases-oriented, meaning that it's okay for him to have a rough start in the early game as long as he starts to do work towards the mid-game. So while he did receive some minor buffs to his bases in the form of +2 speed, so that he can actually fucking double soldiers at base, and +4 luck, I tried to improve Bartre's growths instead, making him seem even more appealing as a glorified slot machine of a unit. Surprisingly, his vanilla growths weren't actually that much better than Dorcas's, with the only significant difference between them being a 20% speed growth. This also meant that Bartre's total growth pool was actually somewhat low for someone who's supposed to be about improving gradually over time. To remedy this, I boosted his growth total from 290 to 325, shifting his growths around in a way to make him more of a glass cannon. This means that he actually lost 10% of his defense growth in order to gain 10% to both strength and speed, giving him a rather impressive 60% strength growth and 50% speed growth, hopefully turning him into a very dangerous combat unit, albeit at the cost of his durability, which felt more like Dorcas's specialty. Also, I took away a tiny 5% of his skill growth and boosted his luck growth by 25%, because it just felt right. Are you gonna look at a unit like Bartre and tell me that this man doesn't find lucky pennies on a daily basis? The man literally found his wife in the Colosseum. Of course he's supposed to be stupidly lucky, and now his stats represent that. Now, while these buffs to his growths should help Bartre's viability in the long term, they are just a should at the end of the day. The problem with buffing growths is that you're only going to see the improvements if you get lucky enough, so there's still the absolute possibility that Bartre will get stat screwed and not see any upgrades as the game progresses. However, I felt like improving other elements of the character would either be too much or completely invalidate Dorcas in the process. So I personally feel like leaving him as somewhat of a meme unit is perfectly acceptable. Just flip the coin and hope you get lucky.
Let's go gambling! Aw, dang it! 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 Aw, dang it!
I'm gonna be completely honest here, making Karla into a B-tier unit is virtually impossible, due to the fact that the requirements for getting her are so strict and she's only available for a total of 3 chapters, all of which have very limited deployment slots. In order to be a unit who's about as strong as late game characters like Vida and Jafar, Karla needs to be exceedingly strong. Like, monstrously strong, to the point where her strengths would have to greatly outweigh her borderline non-existent availability. So, since this character is only usable for less than 5% of the game and is effectively a bonus character, I decided to follow the course of making her stats absolutely disgustingly broken. Literally every single stat, excluding defense, has received an incredibly significant buff, with the biggest ones being the monstrous plus 11 HP because her base health of 29 was absolutely pathetic, and plus 7 to skill and speed, allowing her to have thoroughly reliable hit and crit chances with the ability to double almost everything from chapter 32 onwards. Perhaps outside of Swordmasters. I also added a little bonus to our starting inventory, that being a wind sword, a weapon that is otherwise unobtainable throughout the entire game.
Unless you have the fabled double dash bonus disc.
Meaning that you'll get an additional reward upon going through this absolute enigma of a recruitment, giving you a weapon that will help out even if Karla isn't actively fielded. Even with all these buffs though, I'd still probably place this character towards the middle of B tier. Sure, her stats have gone from borderline arthritic to pretty impressive, and she'll even have access to 1-2 range as a permanently sword-locked unit. But at the end of the day, she's still only going to be used for a max of 3 chapters. Regardless, I felt like buffing anything else would have just been overkill, as growths are irrelevant for her, and giving this edgelord a personal weapon would have made her far too powerful for the masses to handle. So Karla will just have to be content knowing that she completely outclasses her brother since she doesn't have to compete with Harken for a slot in the army.
Because if she did, I'd still pick Harken. Hark!
Outside of vanilla Karla and Will, I'd say Wallace probably holds the title of being the weakest unit in the game, requiring extremely heavy Lin mode favoritism in order to stand a chance against hordes of enemies, especially in his joining chapter of Four-Fanged Offense. It also doesn't help that he's competing with another unit in the form of Geats, as while it's generally more cumbersome to recruit him, he's absolutely the better of the 2 units, boasting higher kill potential as well as hard mode bonuses boosting his stats. So, my main goal for buffing Wallace to a roundabout B tier was to make him just as viable as Geats. making it so that if you have to play the Lloyd version of this chapter, you aren't immediately punished with a significantly weaker unit. Furthermore, since the two units are supposed to serve two completely different roles in the army, I decided to buff Wallace's strengths rather than trying to improve his weaker areas. Although a vanilla Wallace is basically weak in every single area that isn't his defense stat. This means that Wallace has received a number of buffs to his stats, primarily his skill and HP, which have received significant improvements. This will give Wallace more lasting power and much greater reliability when it comes to hitting enemies, turning him into a far more efficient enemy phase unit in a game that is absolutely enemy phase focused. These buffs paired with a minor +2 strength and +2 speed should make Wallace a far more intimidating foe for the enemy to conquer. In addition to this, while unassuming, I've also boosted his axe rank to C, allowing him to use killer axes at base, which when paired with his now alarmingly high skill will give him dangerously high crit chances, as well as placing his overall weapon ranks to be on par with Geet's at the same time. And while these buffs are definitely impactful, it is likely that Wallace will still end up weaker than a trained Oswin at this point, which is completely fine. If you decided to invest heavily into a unit, feeding them kills and resources whenever available, they absolutely should turn out stronger than your average pre-promote. However, in the situation where the player decided to ignore Oswin, they'll be given the option to use a general who may not be too impressive in the speed department, but will more than make up for it with good bulk and reliability, grading him as a strong unit who can assuredly warrant a deployment slot in certain chapters. His supports are also fantastic, which might not mean much to a good amount of players, but these buffs would hopefully introduce a lot of inexperienced players to the glory that is Wallace's character, because his stats really didn't reflect how great this unit's personality and brash nature truly is. Seriously, vote for Wallace to get into heroes, or don't, and get 8 more Camilla ults. I don't really care at the end of the day. Okay, this is the one. This is the character that took me the absolute longest to figure out on how I'm supposed to get her into A tier, alongside units like Lowen, Raven, and Priscilla. And let's get something straight. I did not just give her a personal weapon and call it a day. Nino is a classically debated character in the Fire Emblem community, with one side claiming that you just need to invest a little bit into her to receive a character who becomes capable of soloing maps in the blink of an eye, whilst the other half believes that she's a waste of space and she shall not be spared a single drop of experience. Honestly, I think it's pretty difficult to claim that Nino is great in the year of 2024, but I also like to think that people really oversell just how supposedly feeble she is. My 2 cents aside, when it came to fixing her, I needed to keep one part of her character absolutely untouched and intact, that being the power fantasy of leveling a character from 0 to hero. The entire reason people fawn over this character is the same as why people are so fond of the Est archetype to begin with. It's a lot of fun to give a weaker character a bunch of XP and watch them gain 4 to 5 stats on average, quickly turning them into a harbinger of death. In order to keep Nino very firmly in the Est archetype, I've only lightly touched her bases, bestowing upon her +2 magic, skill, and constitution, as well as +3 luck. The combat stats will obviously help her immediately mediocre performance in battle, but the one stat I thought was just comically low was her vanilla constitution. I understand, Nino's supposed to be a petite 14-year-old girl. It would be kind of jarring to watch her wield heavier tomes without facing some kind of speed penalty. But for God's sake, she started with the same con as Nils, who's supposed to be a sickly child! By giving her this +2 constitution, it will place her on the same level as Urk, which feels reasonable whilst not being overpowering. In regards to Nino's growths, she's received some generally minor improvements to her magic, skill, and speed growths. And you might think it's weird to give an Est some upgrades to her growths, but would you believe that this character who's supposed to be about snowballing into a devastatingly strong unit doesn't even have the best growths in the game? Instead, Lyn and Hector are tied at 335, just above Nino. So to remedy this, I boosted her a little bit over the edge, raising her up to 350, cementing her as the absolute growth unit of Blazing Blade, who will still almost certainly get skill, luck, and res on her first level because it isn't Nino if she doesn't disappoint you. I hate you! We're still not done either, as she's received some significant alterations to her inventory as well. Rather than starting with an Elfire tome that would cause her to lose a large portion of her already mediocre speed, she'll now start with a plain old Fire tome, causing her to be completely alleviated of the speed penalty in Battle Before Dawn. You may also notice the Guiding Ring now in her inventory, which I added because Guiding Rings were already an extremely rare commodity in FE7, so by having her join the party with one, you won't have to invest any of your existing resources on her in order for her to promote. Finally, the Torch Staff in her inventory isn't just there for when she promotes, as I've added one last buff to Nino at base, that being the ability to use staves. Nino needs to be able to offer something immediately outside of incredibly substandard combat. There just isn't a reason to deploy her outside of unit bias. By allowing her to use staves at base, she'll be supplied with a multitude of different options to help the army, be it through healing, dispelling fog of war, or even eventually using status staves, which she isn't that far off of using either as she starts at C rank. Even though I buffed basically every single aspect of this green goblin, I'm not fully convinced that she'll be able to hang out with the other big boys in A tier. She's still absolutely worse than Pent, but now I feel like she'll at least have a fighting chance when competing for deployment slots in late game, and have something unique that makes her stand apart from the otherwise homogenous mages littering your army. Either way, we'll still never have an answer to the age-old question of whether Nino is good or bad. She's bad. She's clearly bad. How are we still discussing this in 2024? Will sucks. I adore early game archers, and even I think he sucks. There's absolutely no avoiding the fact that almost every single facet of this unit is borderline unsalvageable. Even his other archer comrade in arms, Rebecca, has some redeeming features, like great availability and good growths. Whilst Will is going to be weak, unless you decided to spoon feed him every single kill during Lin mode. But we're not talking about Lin mode, are we?
No.
By nature of being stuck on a very weak class with some of the worst bases in the entire game, and honestly in the entire series, Will requires some heavy buffs in order for him to not get immediately benched. Thankfully, my random placements decided to place the poor child in C tier, meaning that I don't need to double all of his stats in order to make him viable. Similar to Dorcas and Wallace, I decided to play to Will's strengths, that being his role as the stronger archer, as while Rebecca is more focused on speed and dealing damage through doubling, Will is focused around hitting hard a single time. For starters, a massive issue I had with Will's stats was his weirdly poor con, being only a measly 6, which causes him to get weighed down by the majority of bows. In order to fix this, he's received an additional 3 points of constitution, causing him to lose exactly 0 speed when using a steel bow, allowing that to be his main way of mitigating any speed issues. In addition to this, Will has gained a gargantuan buff to his skill with plus 6 points, as well as plus 3 strength and plus 2 luck. With these improvements to his skill and luck, Will no longer has any issues whatsoever when it comes to being actually able to hit his targets, giving him immense reliability when it comes to taking down foes, additionally helped by some extra punch with plus 3 strength. I opted to avoid giving him any speed, as that felt more like Rebecca's specialty, and it's not as though Will's growths are poor to the point where he's super unlikely to get speed anyway. Furthermore, I've also raised his starting bow rank from D to C, and given him a killer bow to start with, making Will a genuine threat from the moment you get him, as despite effective weaponry only dealing 2 times damage instead of the usual times 3, he's perfectly capable of one-rounding the irritating swarms of Pegasus Knights that plague Hector hard mode. Seriously man, this shit's the fucking worst. He's still nothing incredible, to be honest, and he's certainly not going to double anything with that base 6 speed, but at the very least, he'll have some use in Noble Lady of Kalen, which is more than I could have said for his performance in vanilla FE7. Frankly, I was tempted to change effectiveness to 3 times damage like in the Japanese version, but by doing so it really would have messed with the game's balance overall, and that's a can of worms that I really didn't want to open. And to be honest, I'm not entirely sure how to end this section. So...
Shut up, Will.
Okay, hear me out, you guys. Even though her base stats are awful and she'll never have any enemy phase throughout the entire game, she's good. She's good, you guys. You just gotta trust me. Yeah, it's no secret that Rebecca is incredibly similar to Will in that she shares pretty much the exact same set of weaknesses, with the small redeeming feature of having mildly better availability. Whilst I'm sure a lot of people would immediately clamor towards her growths to try and proclaim that she's perfectly good, one look at her learning to count upwards ass bases should tell you that this character is basically only used prior to having battle prep, at which point she'll spend the rest of the game in grayscale. Fortunately for her though, I had to place Rebecca in B tier, meaning I had to give her some major buffs in order to get her to the same power level as units like Oswin and Canas. Units who have definite strengths but also have their fair share of weaknesses to balance them. For starters, her growths have remained completely unchanged, since they were never the issue with Rebecca, as having a 60% speed growth for a unit that effectively joins from Chapter 2 onwards is genuinely pretty impressive. Instead, Rebecca follows the way of the bases, receiving improvements to her HP, strength, skill, resistance, and large buffs to her speed. While the other stat increases may be minor, mostly 1 or 2 points here and there to help her overall viability, I've given Rebecca plus 5 speed at base, basically allowing her to double every non-sword wielding unit type from the very start of the game. giving her a niche that no units other than Guy and Marcus will be able to fill. Up front, this might seem totally busted and redundant, given that her speed growth is going to be rendered obsolete by her exceedingly high base, and the fact that she doubles everything won't matter considering her strength is a paltry 5, but bear with me for a moment. Firstly, the fact that she is likely to cap speed is to entice players into early promoting her, something that I feel a lot of Fire Emblem players are really averse to doing. There's nothing wrong with getting a little greedy and trying to see a level 20 unit's promoted stats, but most of the time it comes off as kind of pointless since the game will be at least halfway done by that point. Regardless, I've tried to make Rebecca almost into a bow myrmidon in a way, having enough speed to be a genuine threat to enemies on player phase at the cost of not having an enemy phase whatsoever. Furthermore, in regards to her strength issues, I decided to barely change that. 1, to give Will a more unique role as the heavy-hitting but slow archer, and 2, because I also gave her a rather unique buff to fix her strength issues which would be completely up to the player. Rebecca boasts the fire affinity, a particularly dangerous trait to have if paired with someone who also wields the same affinity, like Lowen or Dart. Two characters who Rebecca is perfectly able to support with. Double fire support will give both support partners +3 damage along with +15 hit, crit, and avoid, making for an incredibly potent boost to both of their combat stats, but particularly fixing Rebecca's strength issues. In order to form this A support more swiftly, I've made it so Rebecca's initial bond with Lowen starts at 40 instead of 5, as well as boosted the growth from 4 points from 2. And for those unaware, this effectively means that Rebecca will only need to spend 10 turns adjacent to Lowen before they're able to start their C support, and then an additional 20 turns after that for B and A support respectively. This turns an otherwise sluggish support into one of the quickest in the game, rivaled only by bonds like Hector Eliwood and Lynn Florina. With all of these improvements to her overall kit, I feel like Rebecca is genuinely a force to be reckoned with on player phase, as she'll be able to double the majority of units right away and fix her potential damage issues through supporting with characters like Lowen and Dart. Sure, she's still not going to be doing anything on enemy phase, but that's the same for every single archer across most of the franchise, because Intelligent Systems doesn't want archers to have nice things. Unless of course it's Echoes, in which case nice fortress, dipshit, now eat this hunter's volley! And at last, we return to the progenitor of all things disappointing, that being Lady Lindis herself. Lynn is obviously a fan favourite, boasting a pretty wide fanbase due to being a good amount of people's first exposure to the horror that is Fire Emblem, meaning that most players remember her as being quite impressive due to her normal mode performance. Now, if you've messed around with Lynn for more than 5 seconds in Hector Hard mode, you'll very quickly learn that this unit is bad! No beating around the bush, no trying to conjure up excuses on how she can be potentially viable, she's just bad. She has a multitude of extremely heavy issues that can't be solved easily, as her bases are very underwhelming without any Lynn mode influence, she's locked to a weapon that is exclusively 1 range, only gaining a consistent form of 2 range on promotion with bows, and most importantly of all, this dame is fragile. While Lynn's offense can eventually grow into something somewhat okay, having decent growths in all of her offensive stats, the one part about Lynn that will remain pretty much the same from recruitment all the way up into endgame is that Lynn is so goddamn feeble in regards to her bulk that I'm pretty sure harsh words alone would be enough to make her shatter into 1,000 pieces. Naturally, the counter-argument to this is that of course she's supposed to be brittle. She's the Lord equivalent of a Myrmidon, meaning that she shouldn't be soaking up damage, she should be outright avoiding it. And against axe units, this works perfectly fine. I can say for sure that Lynn absolutely has no issue dealing with brigands and pirates alike. But there's also a good deal of problems with this as well, that being the small fact that most of the enemies in Hector Hard mode are wielding lances, who will cause her reasonably good dodge chances to become completely nullified. So, in order to get Lynn into A tier, I had to buff her. A lot! Seriously, basically every single part about Lynn outside of her growths has been improved. So let's start with the most basic one, that being her raised stats. To fix her mediocre joining stats, Lynn has received +2 strength, +3 skill, +4 speed, as well as some other minor buffs to her defensive stats. This is effectively to emulate a few extra levels that she would have otherwise received from Lynn mode, acting as a head start for her potentially snowballing into a valuable unit. And as one final buff to her base class, I shifted the 1 point of movement that she would normally gain on promotion to just having it from the start, causing her to have 6 movement right from the get-go. You might wonder why an infantry unit has an extra point of movement for seemingly no reason, to which I reply with, if thieves can have 6 move, so can Lynn. She's agile. Let's just leave it at that. Furthermore, to assist her with her soiree into dodge tanking, I also tweaked the Manikati in a specific way, causing it to become a Reaver weapon, meaning that the weapon triangle is reversed when wielding it. This will allow Lynn to have a way to combat the swarms of lance users that make up most of the enemies from her joining chapter onwards, albeit in a limited form with only 45 uses. I also gave it plus 10 crit, effectively making it a killer Reaver weapon, because she needed to be an A tier, so she's allowed these wacky buffs. Finally, to help Lyn with her performance in late game, I've boosted the qualities of her promotion, Blade Lord. While she doesn't gain movement anymore, she will instead gain an additional plus 3 constitution to help her with heavier weapons. As I'll be honest, her only gaining plus 1 con upon promotion was kinda silly. Moreover, I also decreased the weight of her final weapon, the Soul Carti, from 14 to 10, because that pile of garbage masquerading as a weapon weighing Lyn down by 8 points of speed in vanilla was downright comical. And last, but definitely not least, I thought it was fair to give Lyn the same critical bonus that Swordmasters and Berserkers receive upon promoting, meaning that Lyn will gain an additional plus 15 crit once she's a Blade Lord, creating a unit who will likely be wielding 40% crit chances in most scenarios. With all of these buffs working in junction with one another, I genuinely believe that Lyn's the strongest of the 3 lords now, absolutely outshining Eliwood and likely Hector at the same time. Normally you'd want to use a Heaven Seal on Eliwood before Lyn, due to his promotion fixing so many of his core issues, but now I feel like there would be some legitimate competition to see who can showcase their strengths first. She's not perfect, obviously, but with the ludicrous amounts of gifts I've given to her, she's certainly capable of becoming an absolute demon on the battlefield. The one who will instantly dispatch the enemy! And that just about wraps it up. FE7, while absolutely not my favourite, is a shockingly interesting game despite its seemingly simple outer shell. Its story and gameplay are extremely messy, but outside of the Tellius games, and the Forbidden one that I'm not allowed to talk about, it probably has one of the strongest casts in the series, offering a wide variety of characters who feel less like single personality traits attached to a mannequin and more like actual living, breathing people. It's also the only FE game to not have anything resembling a war going on during the story, so that's definitely a noteworthy aspect of it, even if what we got instead was Nurgle pouting in front of a mirror for 20 plus chapters.
I'm hideous!
Either way, its significance to the community can't be understated, as despite all these flaws, it's still consistently regarded as a favourite amongst many, even managing to make it into r/Fire Emblem's top 5 games as of a recent poll. It may seem plain to a veteran who's played every other game to death, but there's no arguing that when you think of Fire Emblem, chances are your first thoughts are going to go towards FE7 and its motley crew of dolts and doofuses. Hey, how's it going? Thanks for either watching or skipping to the end of my video. This was just something I wanted to see if I could make in proper, and here we are, so I must have done something right. I really hope you enjoyed it, and if you think my ideas for helping some of these weaker characters are wrong or misguided, feel free to offer your own opinions in the comments. And if you agree with me, that works too! This took way too fucking long to make. Way too long. I originally planned this to take like 2 to 3 weeks to coincide with my regular upload schedule. It didn't, because real life stuff happened and I was very slow. The next one will be quicker. Mark my words, it probably won't be. Anyway, maybe the next video will be for you. Anyway, stay tuned for more content, guys. I'll catch you next time.